The fabric ripped with a sound that cut through the Georgia morning air like a gunshot. Elena Vasquez felt the cool breeze hit her exposed back as her training shirt tore away, revealing not just skin, but a jagged scar that told a story of heroism so profound it would silence an entire training facility in seconds. What happened next would transform how the military treated its forgotten heroes forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena Vasquez sat alone on the weathered wooden bench outside Building 47 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, watching the sun climb over the pine trees that surrounded the veteran reintegration facility. At 31, she moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had been rebuilt from broken pieces. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore civilian clothes that hung loose on her small frame, a deliberate choice to avoid drawing attention to herself. For 2 weeks now, she'd been attending the military's newest program, the Veteran Transition and Readiness Initiative, designed to help former service members reintegrate into civilian life or return to active duty after extended medical leave. The program was supposed to be different from traditional military training, more supportive, more understanding of the unique challenges that modern veterans faced. But Elena had quickly learned that some things never changed, no matter how progressive the paperwork claimed to be. The other participants had started talking about her from day one. She could feel their eyes following her during group sessions, hear their whispered conversations when they thought she wasn't listening. To them, she was an enigma wrapped in a mystery. Her intake paperwork listed her as a former Army specialist with an honorable discharge due to medical reasons, but something about her didn't add up. She was too quiet, too observant, too controlled for someone who was supposedly struggling with reintegration. During physical therapy sessions, while others complained about their limitations, Elena moved through exercises with a fluidity that spoke of extensive rehabilitation and discipline. When counselors asked about her service experience, she gave answers that were technically truthful but revealed nothing substantial. She'd served overseas, she'd been injured, she was working on her recovery. End of discussion. The facility itself was designed to feel less intimidating than traditional military installations. The buildings were modern, painted in soothing earth tones, with plenty of natural light and comfortable furniture. Motivational posters lined the walls, featuring diverse groups of smiling veterans engaging in various civilian activities. The message was clear. This was a place of healing and hope, not judgment and harsh discipline. But Elena had been around long enough to know that changing the decor didn't automatically change the culture. The same hierarchies existed here, just with different labels. Instead of ranks, there were program levels. Instead of drill sergeants, there were counselors and fitness instructors. But the fundamental dynamics remained the same. Those who appeared weak or different were still targets for those who needed to feel superior. The morning routine was always the same. Elena would arrive 15 minutes early, claim her usual spot on the bench, and prepare herself mentally for another day of careful navigation through social landmines. She had learned long ago that the best strategy was to remain invisible, to avoid giving anyone a reason to single her out for attention. But invisibility was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Her performance in group activities was consistently excellent, despite her apparent physical limitations. During problem-solving exercises, Elena offered solutions that demonstrated tactical thinking that went far beyond basic military training. When other participants struggled with leadership scenarios, Elena would quietly suggest approaches that showed a deep understanding of command structure and crisis management. Sergeant First Class Jake Hoffman had been watching her with growing suspicion. Hoffman was a career soldier who'd never seen combat, but had built his reputation on breaking down recruits who thought they were tougher than they actually were. He was 35 years old, built like a linebacker, with a shaved head and a collection of unit patches on his civilian training gear that advertised his military experience to anyone who cared to look. Hoffman represented the old-school approach to military training. He believed that comfort breed weakness, that soldiers needed to be pushed to their breaking points to discover their true capabilities. The touchy-feely approach of the veteran reintegration program went against every instinct he developed during his 15 years of service, but he'd learned to mask his disapproval behind professional courtesy and program guidelines.
The other participants had formed their own opinions about Elena, influenced by a combination of curiosity, resentment, and the natural human tendency to create narratives that made sense of confusing situations. Specialist Brittany Knox, a blonde former military police officer from Tennessee, had emerged as the unofficial leader of Elena's critics. Knox was 26 years old, loud, confident, and used to being the center of attention in any group she joined. Knox's theory, which she shared freely with anyone who would listen, was that Elena was some kind of fraud. Maybe she'd never actually served in a combat role, or maybe her injuries were psychological rather than physical, or maybe she had connections that got her into the program despite not meeting the usual qualifications. Whatever the truth was, Knox was convinced that Elena was getting special treatment that she didn't deserve. Private First Class Tyler Beck, a former infantry soldier from Ohio, had his own suspicions about Elena. Beck was 23 years old, eager to prove himself, and frustrated by his own struggles with the program's requirements. His service record was solid but unremarkable, and he'd been hoping that the reintegration program would give him the boost he needed to advance his military career. Elena's quiet competence made his own limitations more obvious, which translated into resentment that he expressed through increasingly pointed comments and challenges. Private Chloe Fisher represented a different type of skepticism. Fisher was a former communications specialist who genuinely believed in the program's mission of supporting struggling veterans. She'd volunteered to mentor newer participants and took pride in her ability to help others work through their challenges. But Elena's self-sufficiency frustrated Fisher's desire to be needed, leading her to interpret Elena's independence as arrogance or unwillingness to accept help. The dynamic between these personalities had been building for 2 weeks, creating an atmosphere of tension that Elena recognized all too well. She'd seen it before in other contexts, the way groups of people could turn against someone who didn't fit their expectations or threaten their sense of order. The smart play was to keep her head down, complete the program requirements, and move on to whatever came next. But Elena had learned through hard experience that sometimes keeping your head down wasn't enough. Sometimes the group dynamics reached a tipping point where someone became a target whether they wanted to or not. And as she sat on her bench that morning, watching Hoffman set up equipment for the day's training exercises, she could feel that tipping point approaching with the inevitability of an incoming storm. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd survived situations that most people couldn't even imagine, faced enemies who would have killed her without hesitation, made decisions under pressure that had saved dozens of lives. But here, in what was supposed to be a supportive environment designed to help veterans transition back to normal life, she was once again preparing for battle. The difference was that this time, the enemy wasn't wearing a uniform or carrying weapons that she could see. This time, the threat came from people who were supposed to be on her side, people who shared her background and should have understood the challenges she'd faced. This time, the battle would be fought with words and assumptions and the cruel human tendency to tear down what we don't understand. As other participants began arriving for the morning session, Elena closed the notebook she'd been writing in and stood up. She'd spent the past 2 weeks observing, learning, preparing. She knew who the key players were, understood the group dynamics, could predict how conflicts would develop and escalate. What she couldn't predict was how they would react when they discovered the truth about who she really was, when they learned that the quiet woman they'd been dismissing and undermining was someone whose service record was classified at levels they'd never even heard of. When they saw the evidence of what she'd sacrificed in service to her country written in scar tissue across her body. Elena tucked her notebook into her bag and walked toward the training facility. She had a feeling that today would be different, that the careful balance she'd maintained for 2 weeks was about to be shattered. The question wasn't whether her secret would be revealed. Secrets had a way of coming out eventually, especially in environments where people were looking for reasons to challenge each other. The question was whether she was ready for the consequences of that revelation, and whether the people around her were prepared to face the reality of what they'd been doing to a genuine American hero.
The whispers started before Elena even reached the main building. She could hear fragments of conversation drifting across the courtyard as other participants gathered in small groups, their voices carrying the particular tone that people use when they're discussing someone they think can't hear them. I'm telling you, something's not right about her, Brittany Knox was saying to a cluster of female participants near the water fountain. Her Tennessee accent became more pronounced when she was worked up, and this morning she was clearly agitated. 2 weeks and she hasn't said more than 10 words about her actual service. What kind of veteran doesn't want to talk about what they did? Knox had positioned herself as the unofficial spokesperson for the group's concerns about Elena, a role that seemed to energize her more than any of the actual program activities. She thrived on being the center of attention, and Elena's mysterious background provided her with an endless source of material for speculation and gossip. "Maybe she's embarrassed," suggested Private Fisher, though her tone indicated she didn't entirely believe her own words. Some people have a hard time opening up about traumatic experiences. "Embarrassed?" Knox laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Look at how she moves, Chloe. Look at how she handles every physical challenge they throw at us. That's not someone who's struggling with trauma. That's someone who's been through way more training than she's admitting to." Tyler Beck had been listening from a nearby bench, his jaw working rhythmically as he chewed gum and processed the conversation. At 23, he was younger than most of the other participants, but his infantry background gave him credibility when discussions turned to combat experience and military hierarchy. "You want to know what I think?" Beck stood up and walked over to join the group. "I think she's some kind of plant. Maybe she's here to evaluate the program, write reports about how we're all handling the transition. Think about it. She shows up with paperwork nobody's seen before, she's obviously in better shape than half the instructors, and she takes notes on everything." The suggestion sent a ripple of unease through the group. The idea that Elena might be there in some kind of official capacity, observing and judging their performance, transformed their general suspicion into something more pointed and potentially dangerous. "That would explain why Hoffman keeps watching her," added another participant, a former mechanic named Rodriguez who rarely spoke up during group discussions. "I caught him checking his file yesterday when he thought nobody was looking. And when she finished that obstacle course in record time last week, he didn't seem surprised. He seemed, I don't know, like he was expecting it." Sergeant First Class Jake Hoffman had indeed been watching Elena more closely than the other participants, but not for the reasons they imagined. His 15 years of military experience had given him an ability to read people, to identify the subtle signs that distinguish genuine soldiers from those who were just playing the part. And everything about Elena Vasquez suggested that she was significantly more than her paperwork indicated. It wasn't just her physical capabilities, though those were impressive enough. Elena moved with the unconscious efficiency of someone who'd been through extensive combat training. Her situational awareness was constantly active. She knew where every exit was, who was approaching from behind, which participants were agitated or potentially volatile. During group exercises, she naturally positioned herself where she could observe the entire room while keeping her back protected. More telling were the small details that most people wouldn't notice. The way she automatically counted steps when walking through new areas. How she instinctively cataloged potential weapons in any room she entered. The fact that she never fully relaxed, even during supposedly casual social interactions. These weren't the behaviors of a typical veteran struggling with reintegration. These were the ingrained habits of someone who'd operated in environments where constant vigilance was the difference between life and death. But Hochman's growing awareness of Elena's true capabilities only made him more frustrated with his inability to categorize her properly. The reintegration program had strict guidelines about how to handle different types of participants, and Elena didn't fit any of the established profiles. She wasn't struggling academically, physically, or socially in ways that the program was designed to address. If anything, she was outperforming participants who had supposedly more extensive military backgrounds. The morning's training session was scheduled to focus on team-building exercises, the kind of activities that program designers believed would help veterans develop trust and communication skills that would serve them in civilian employment. Hoffman had organized a series of physical challenges that required cooperation and mutual support, designed to break down barriers and encourage participants to rely on each other. Elena arrived at the training area exactly on time, as she had every day for the past 2 weeks. She wore the standard-issue gray training shirt and black shorts that all participants were required to use during physical activities. Her gear was meticulously organized, her appearance neat and professional.
Nothing about her suggested that she was anything other than a dedicated program participant working hard to complete her requirements.
But the atmosphere in the training area was different this morning. The whispered conversations had done their work, spreading suspicion and resentment throughout the group. Elena could feel the shift in energy as soon as she arrived. Where before the other participants had simply ignored her, now they were actively watching her, measuring her responses, looking for evidence to support their theories about her true purpose there. Knox had positioned herself near the equipment area, where she could observe Elena's preparations while continuing to build support for her position. "Just watch how she sets up her gear," Knox said quietly to the participants around her. "Look at that organization. That's not how someone struggling with reintegration handles their equipment. That's how someone with advanced training operates." The psychological dynamic was becoming dangerous in ways that Elena recognized from other contexts. Group suspicion, once it reached a certain threshold, had a tendency to seek resolution through confrontation. The longer the questions about her background remained unanswered, the more the group would feel justified in taking action to force those answers. Elena had faced similar situations before, though usually in contexts where the stakes were more obviously life and death. She understood how group psychology worked, how individual doubts could amplify into collective action, how people who might never act alone could become bold when they felt supported by others who shared their suspicions. The smart strategy would be to address the situation directly, to provide enough information to satisfy their curiosity without revealing details that needed to remain classified. But Elena's training and experience had taught her to be extremely careful about what information she shared and with whom. The security clearances and classification levels associated with her actual service record weren't something she could discuss casually, even in a military environment. As participants gathered for the morning briefing, Elena noticed that the usual informal social groups had reorganized themselves in ways that isolated her more completely than before. Where previously she'd simply been ignored, now she was being actively excluded from conversations and group formations. The message was clear. Until she provided satisfactory answers about who she really was and why she was there, she would be treated as an outsider at best and a potential threat at worst. Hoffman called the group to attention and began outlining the day's activities. Elena listened with the same professional focus she brought to all program requirements, but part of her attention was devoted to monitoring the mood and behavior of the people around her. The tension was building towards some kind of resolution, and her experience suggested that resolution was likely to be unpleasant for everyone involved. What the other participants didn't realize was that Elena had been through situations far more dangerous than anything they could create in a training environment. She'd survived combat situations where the wrong decision would have meant death for herself and others. She'd endured interrogation techniques designed to break even the most highly trained operatives. She'd made life-and-death decisions under pressure that most people couldn't imagine. But all of that experience had also taught her that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones who should have been allies. Sometimes the greatest threats came not from obvious adversaries, but from people on your own side who decided you didn't belong. And as she prepared for the morning's training exercises, Elena could feel that particular type of danger building around her like a storm waiting to break.
The first station of the obstacle course was a wall traverse that required team members to work together to get everyone over a 12-foot barrier. It was designed to be impossible for any individual to complete alone, forcing groups to cooperate, communicate, and trust each other with their physical safety. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a straightforward team-building exercise. But the dynamics within Team 3 had transformed a simple physical challenge into something far more complex and dangerous. Knox immediately positioned herself as the team's tactical leader, directing the other participants into positions around the wall with the confidence of someone who believed her military police background qualified her to make strategic decisions for the group. Her plan was conventional but sound. The strongest team members would boost the lighter participants over the wall, then be pulled up by those who had already crossed.
Johnson and Beck, you're our anchors, Knox announced, pointing to the base of the wall. Williams and Fisher, you'll go over first and set up the rope system on the other side. Elena, she paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the woman who had become the focus of the team's suspicion. Elena, you can go in the middle. We'll get you over when it's your turn. The assignment was deliberately condescending, positioning Elena as someone who needed to be helped rather than someone who could contribute to the team's success. It was a continuation of the morning's psychological pressure, designed to reinforce the narrative that Elena didn't belong with experienced veterans who could handle challenging situations. Elena recognized the tactical purpose behind Knox's assignment, but she also saw the flaws in the proposed approach. The rope system Knox was planning would work, but it was inefficient and potentially dangerous if not executed correctly. There were better ways to get 6 people over a 12-foot wall, methods that would be faster and safer for everyone involved. But offering tactical advice would only fuel more suspicion about her background and training. Elena had learned through hard experience that sometimes the best strategy was to let people make their mistakes and deal with the consequences, especially when those people were actively looking for reasons to view her as a threat. The first part of Knox's plan went smoothly enough. Williams, who was lean and athletic, was boosted to the top of the wall by Johnson and Beck. Once there, he helped pull Fisher up beside him. The rope system they established on the far side was adequate for the task, if not particularly elegant. But when it came time for Elena's turn, Knox decided to make a statement. Instead of following the same process they'd used for Williams and Fisher, Knox announced a change in procedure. "You know what?" Knox said, her voice carrying clearly across the training area. "I think Elena should demonstrate some of this specialized training she's been keeping secret. If she's really as qualified as her mysterious paperwork suggests, she should be able to handle this wall without help." Beck grinned and nodded his agreement. "Yeah, let's see what all that classified background amounts to in a real situation. If she's been holding back during regular training, now's the time to show us what she can really do." Elena looked up at the 12-foot barrier, her mind automatically calculating angles, grip points, and the biomechanics required for an unassisted climb. It wasn't impossible. She'd scaled much more difficult obstacles under combat conditions, but it wasn't the point of the exercise. The wall traverse was designed to require teamwork, specifically to teach lessons about cooperation and mutual support. "The exercise parameters call for team assistance," Elena said calmly, her voice carrying no defensiveness despite the obvious challenge in Knox's demand. "The exercise parameters are designed for people who actually need help. If you're as qualified as you pretend to be, prove it. Show us what makes you so special that you get to skip all the normal procedures for getting into this program." Other teams working on nearby obstacles had begun to notice the confrontation. Participants paused in their own exercises to watch what was clearly becoming more than just a simple disagreement about tactics. The attention from spectators added another layer of pressure to a situation that was already escalating beyond normal team-building tensions. Johnson and Beck moved positions that effectively blocked Elena's access to the wall unless she went through them first. It was a subtle form of physical intimidation, using their larger size and advantageous positioning to reinforce Knox's verbal challenge. Elena could feel Hoffman's eyes on their group from across the training area. The sergeant's attention was focused and calculating, suggesting he was ready to intervene if the situation became overtly dangerous. But he was also allowing the confrontation to develop, perhaps curious to see how Elena would handle the pressure. "I'm not here to prove anything to you," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of calm that people who don't understand combat sometimes mistake for weakness. "I'm here to complete the program requirements and move on." Knox interpreted Elena's measured response as evidence that her challenge was working. "That's not good enough anymore. We've been patient with your mysterious background and your refusal to be a part of the team. But if you want our help getting over this wall, you need to start being honest about who you really are."
Williams called down from the top of the wall, his voice concerned. "Hey, can we just focus on getting everyone over? We can sort out personality conflicts after we finish the course." But Beck was enjoying the confrontation too much to let it end with a reasonable compromise. "No, I think Knox is right. We deserve to know who we're working with. Elena's been taking notes on all of us for 2 weeks, analyzing our performance, judging how we handle pressure. If she wants us to trust her, she needs to show us the same respect." The accusation that Elena had been evaluating the other participants struck a particular nerve because it contained just enough truth to be believable. Elena had been observing and analyzing, though not for the reasons Beck imagined. Her situational awareness and threat assessment were automatic responses, ingrained through years of operating in hostile environments where the wrong evaluation could be fatal. Fisher tried once more to defuse the situation. Look, whatever Elena's background is, she's here for the same reason we all are. Can't we just help each other get through this and deal with personal issues later? Knox turned on Fisher with surprising vehemence. Personal issues? Chloe, this isn't about hurt feelings. This is about integrity. This is about people earning their place instead of getting special treatment because of connections or classified paperwork that nobody's allowed to examine. Elena realized that the confrontation had moved beyond rational discussion into something more primal and dangerous. Knox wasn't just demanding information anymore. She was demanding submission, acknowledgement that Elena's presence in the program was illegitimate and that the group had the right to challenge her authority to be there. The psychological dynamics were familiar from other contexts where Elena had been forced to navigate hostile social environments while maintaining operational security. The solution was usually to provide just enough information to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything that could compromise ongoing operations or classified programs. But this situation was different because Elena was no longer operating undercover. Her service was complete, her missions declassified at levels that mattered, her obligations to maintain absolute secrecy technically expired. The question wasn't whether she could reveal information about her background, but whether doing so would make the situation better or worse. Looking at the faces around her, Knox's flushed determination, Beck's aggressive excitement, Johnson's eager anticipation of conflict, Elena realized that providing information would only escalate the confrontation. These weren't people looking for truth. These were people looking for justification for their prejudices and resentments. "The wall is 12 feet high," Elena said finally, her voice carrying a new edge that made several team members take an involuntary step backward. "I can get over it with or without help. The question is whether you want to complete this exercise as a team or whether you want to continue this discussion on the other side while Sergeant Hoffman watches us fail to meet the basic requirements of military cooperation." Knox's eyes blazed with fury at Elena's refusal to submit to the group's demands. "Fine," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "If that's how you want to play this, then let's see what you're really made of."
What happened next would be debated and analyzed for months afterward, with different witnesses providing conflicting accounts of who initiated the physical contact and whether what followed could be classified as an accident or deliberate assault. But in the moment, as Knox stepped forward with her hands raised toward Elena's shoulders, there was no ambiguity about the aggressive intent behind her actions. "Let me help you get started," Knox said, her voice carrying false sweetness that fooled no one. She reached for Elena's training shirt, ostensibly to provide assistance with the wall climb, but her grip was rough and controlling, rather than supportive. Sometimes people need a little encouragement to show their true capabilities. Elena recognized the maneuver for what it was, an attempt to physically dominate and humiliate her in front of witnesses, designed to break down her psychological defenses and force her to react in ways that would justify further escalation. It was a classic bullying tactic, using the pretense of helpfulness to mask aggressive behavior that could later be defended as misunderstood assistance. But Knox had made a critical miscalculation. She was operating under the assumption that Elena was what she appeared to be, a struggling veteran who could be intimidated through physical confrontation and social pressure. Knox had no idea that she was putting her hands on someone who had survived situations where physical restraint was the precursor to torture, interrogation, or execution. Elena's training kicked in with automatic precision. Years of muscle memory and conditioned responses took over as Knox's grip tightened on her shirt. Elena shifted her weight, angled her body to create leverage, and prepared to neutralize what her combat-trained reflexes interpreted as a hostile restraint attempt. But even as her body prepared for defensive action, her mind was calculating the broader implications of the situation. Any physical response she made would be interpreted through the lens of the group's existing suspicions about her background. If she demonstrated the kind of advanced combative training that would end the confrontation quickly, she would only fuel more questions about who she really was and what she was hiding. Knox, emboldened by Elena's apparent passivity, increased the pressure of her grip and began pushing Elena toward the wall with unnecessary force. "Come on, mystery woman," she taunted, loud enough for the spectators from other teams to hear clearly. "Show us some of that special training you've been keeping secret." Beck moved to Knox's left, positioning himself to assist with what was rapidly becoming a physical assault disguised as team-building assistance. Johnson flanked Elena's right side, creating a triangular formation that effectively trapped her between three larger individuals who were becoming increasingly aggressive in their handling. "Maybe she needs more motivation," Beck suggested, reaching for Elena's other arm with the confidence of someone who believed he was participating in justified peer pressure rather than contributing to a dangerous escalation of violence. That's when Elena made a decision that would change everything that followed. Instead of using her combat training to neutralize the threat, instead of demonstrating the advanced techniques that would end the confrontation in seconds, she chose to endure the assault and let the situation develop naturally. It was a tactical decision based on long-term strategic thinking rather than immediate tactical advantage. Knox, interpreting Elena's lack of resistance as confirmation that her target was weak and vulnerable, decided to escalate the humiliation. "You know what?" she announced to the growing audience of spectators. "I think Elena needs to understand what real team building looks like. Sometimes you have to strip away the pretense to get to the truth underneath." The words were barely out of Knox's mouth when she grabbed Elena's training shirt with both hands and pulled, intending to tear the fabric enough to embarrass and intimidate without causing serious physical harm. It was meant to be a power play, a demonstration of dominance that would force Elena to submit to the group's demands for information about her background. But the gray cotton training shirt, weakened by repeated washing and the stress of Knox's aggressive handling, tore more completely than anyone expected. The fabric separated along the shoulder seam and down the back, leaving Elena's upper body partially exposed to the dozens of people who had gathered to watch the confrontation. The immediate reaction from the spectators was a mixture of shocked gasps and uncomfortable laughter, the kind of response that accompanies witnessing something that crosses the line from acceptable behavior into genuine assault. Several participants pulled out phones to record what they assumed would be a humiliating moment that would be shared and discussed for weeks afterward. Knox stepped back, her face showing a mixture of triumph and uncertainty, as she realized she had gone further than originally intended. The torn shirt dangled from Elena's shoulders, held in place only by the remaining sleeve and collar. What had started as intimidation had become public humiliation of a type that could have serious disciplinary consequences if reported to higher authorities. But instead of the embarrassment and submission that Knox expected to see, Elena's expression remained calm and controlled. She stood in the center of the group's attention with the same professional composure she had maintained throughout 2 weeks of escalating harassment. There was no shame in her posture, no indication that the physical assault had achieved its intended psychological effect. And then someone in the crowd behind Elena drew a sharp breath that cut through the morning air like a blade. "Jesus Christ," Williams whispered from his position on top of the wall, his voice carrying a note of stunned recognition that made everyone in the immediate area turn to see what had caught his attention. Elena's back, exposed by the torn shirt, revealed something that transformed the entire nature of the confrontation in an instant. Running from her left shoulder blade down to the middle of her spine was a scar unlike anything the other participants had ever seen. It wasn't the clean line of surgical intervention or the random pattern of accidental injury. This was the deliberate, systematic damage that came from shrapnel, from explosions close enough to embed metal fragments in living tissue. But it wasn't just the size or severity of the scar that made the witnesses fall silent. It was the pattern, the specific configuration of healed wounds that anyone with military experience would recognize as the signature of a particular type of combat injury. The kind of damage that came from improvised explosive devices, from being caught in the killing zone of a coordinated attack, from surviving situations that most people didn't walk away from. Knox, who had been basking in her apparent victory, found herself staring at evidence that completely contradicted every assumption she had made about Elena's background and qualifications. The scar told a story of service and sacrifice that went beyond anything Knox had experienced during her military police duties. Beck, who had been grinning with anticipation of Elena's humiliation, felt his expression freeze as he realized he was looking at the physical evidence of combat service that made his own infantry experience seem routine by comparison. The jokes and challenges that had seemed so justified moments earlier now felt petty and ignorant in the face of obvious proof of Elena's legitimate military credentials. But the real shock was yet to come. As Elena slowly turned to face the group, adjusting the torn shirt to maintain what modesty she could, another scar became visible across her collarbone. This one was different from the shrapnel damage on her back. Cleaner, more precise, clearly the result of deliberate medical intervention under emergency conditions. Fisher, whose communications background had given her exposure to field medical protocols, recognized the scar pattern immediately. "That's from emergency surgery," she said quietly, her voice filled with dawning understanding. "Field surgery, under combat conditions." The implications hit the group like a physical blow. Elena hadn't just been injured in combat. She had been wounded so severely that military surgeons had been forced to operate on her while still in the combat zone, under conditions where failure would mean death, not just from the original injuries, but from the hostile environment that prevented proper medical evacuation. Elena stood in the center of their shocked attention, her torn shirt revealing the physical evidence of service and sacrifice that answered every question about her qualifications, while raising dozens of new questions about exactly what she had endured to earn such scars. Knox's face had gone pale as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. The woman she had been tormenting, the person she had dismissed as weak and unqualified, was clearly a combat veteran whose service had involved levels of danger and sacrifice that Knox had never faced during her military police duties. As the silence stretched across the training area, Elena's calm voice cut through the shock with quiet authority. "Are we going to finish this exercise, or do you need more time to process what you're seeing?"
The silence that followed Elena's question was unlike anything the Fort Bragg training facility had ever experienced. It was the kind of profound quiet that occurs when reality shifts so dramatically that everyone present needs time to recalibrate their understanding of what they thought they knew. Dozens of participants from other teams had abandoned their own exercises to witness what they had initially assumed would be a routine confrontation between team members. But what they were seeing now was something entirely different. The scars on Elena's back and collarbone weren't just evidence of combat service, they were a roadmap of survival through situations that most soldiers would never face. The shrapnel damage alone suggested proximity to explosions that should have been fatal, while the emergency surgery scars spoke to medical intervention performed under the most desperate of circumstances. Williams, still positioned on top of the wall, was the first to break the silence. His communications background had given him exposure to after-action reports and casualty assessments that most soldiers never saw, and he recognized the pattern of injuries spread across Elena's exposed skin. "Those aren't from a single incident," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the training area with the weight of professional analysis. "That's accumulated damage from multiple engagements." The implication hit the gathered crowd like a physical force.
Elena hadn't just been lucky enough to be caught in one explosion or firefight. She had been in situations dangerous enough to cause life-threatening injuries on multiple occasions, and had not only survived, but continued serving despite the obvious risks to her life and health. Knox stood frozen in place, her hands still holding fragments of the training shirt she had torn. The triumphant expression she had worn moments earlier had been replaced by a look of dawning horror as she realized the magnitude of what she had just done. She hadn't just humiliated a fellow veteran. She had publicly assaulted someone whose service record clearly included the kind of combat experience that Knox had never faced. Beck, whose infantry background had given him enough exposure to combat injuries to understand what he was seeing, took several involuntary steps backward. The aggressive confidence that had driven his participation in the morning's harassment had evaporated completely, replaced by the sick realization that he had been tormenting someone whose military credentials were written in scar tissue across her body. But it was Johnson who voiced what everyone was beginning to understand. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the absolute silence. "What the hell did we just do?" Elena remained standing in the center of the group's shocked attention, her posture straight and professional despite the torn shirt and exposed scars. She showed no signs of embarrassment or vulnerability, no indication that the physical assault had achieved any of its intended psychological effects. If anything, the revelation of her injuries seemed to have strengthened her presence rather than weakening it. The crowd of spectators was growing as word spread throughout the training facility that something significant was happening at the obstacle course. Instructors from other programs were arriving to investigate the commotion, their expressions shifting from routine concern to stunned recognition as they saw the evidence displayed across Elena's back. Staff Sergeant Martinez, a veteran instructor who had served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, pushed through the crowd and stopped dead when she saw Elena's scars. Martinez had seen enough battlefield injuries to recognize the specific patterns of damage caused by different types of weapons and explosions. And what she was looking at represented a level of combat exposure that few soldiers survived. "Mother of God," Martinez breathed, her professional composure cracking as she processed the implications of what she was seeing. "Those are Medal of Honor level injuries." The words hung in the morning air like a physical presence. Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, awarded only to those who had distinguished themselves through acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty in combat situations. Martinez's identification wasn't just professional opinion. It was the recognition of someone who had seen enough combat to understand the difference between routine service injuries and the kind of damage that came from extraordinary acts of heroism. Knox's face had gone completely white as the full implications of Martinez's statement sank in. She had spent 2 weeks dismissing and ultimately assaulting someone who might be a recipient of the nation's highest military honor. The thought made her physically ill as she realized that every assumption she had made about Elena's background and qualifications had been not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. Elena herself remained silent, neither confirming nor denying Martinez's assessment. But her lack of surprise at the staff sergeant's recognition spoke volumes about the accuracy of the identification. She had heard similar assessments before, from people qualified to make them. The psychological dynamic of the entire situation had reversed completely in the span of less than a minute. Knox, who had positioned herself as the group's leader and Elena's primary challenger, now found herself in the position of having committed what amounted to assault against a decorated combat veteran. Beck, who had participated enthusiastically in the harassment, was facing the reality that his own infantry service paled in comparison to whatever Elena had endured to earn such scars.
But the transformation went beyond individual embarrassment and regret. The crowd of witnesses was beginning to understand that they had participated, either actively or passively, in the systematic harassment of someone whose service record represented the highest levels of military sacrifice and achievement. The whispered conversations, the suspicious looks,
the deliberate exclusion from group activities. All of it took on a different character when viewed in light of Elena's obvious combat credentials. Fisher, who had tried throughout the morning to diffuse the confrontations and encourage cooperation, felt a wave of shame as she realized she had failed to protect someone who clearly deserved respect and support rather than suspicion and harassment. Her attempts at diplomacy suddenly seemed inadequate in the face of the systematic mistreatment Elena had endured. The arrival of additional instructors and facility staff was creating a crowd that threatened to become unmanageable. Word was spreading throughout Fort Bragg that something extraordinary was happening at the veteran reintegration facility, and people were coming to see for themselves what had caused such a commotion. Sergeant First Class Jake Hoffman was pushing through the crowd with the determined urgency of someone who realized that the situation under his supervision had escalated far beyond normal training incidents. When he finally reached the center of the crowd and saw Elena standing with her torn shirt and exposed scars, his expression shifted from professional concern to something approaching panic. Hoffman had 15 years of military experience, but he had never been in a situation where a participant in his program had been physically assaulted in a way that revealed evidence of extraordinary combat service. The administrative and disciplinary implications were staggering, but more immediately, he was looking at proof that his assessment of Elena's background had been completely wrong. "Everyone back away now!" Hoffman's command voice cut through the murmur of shocked conversations. "Give her some space and someone get me a replacement shirt from the equipment shed." But even as Hoffman tried to restore some semblance of order to the situation, it was clear that the morning's events had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Elena's scars were visible proof of service and sacrifice that transformed every interaction she had with other participants over the past 2 weeks. What had seemed like appropriate questioning of someone's qualifications now looked like harassment of a genuine war hero. Elena accepted the replacement shirt that someone brought from the equipment shed, but before putting it on, she turned slowly so that the gathered crowd could see the full extent of the scarring across her back and shoulders. It wasn't a gesture of defiance or humiliation. It was a quiet statement that she had nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. The pattern of injuries told a story that any experienced soldier could read like a book. Multiple shrapnel wounds from proximity to explosions, surgical scars from field medical procedures performed under combat conditions, the kind of accumulated damage that came from repeated exposure to situations where most people would have been killed or permanently disabled. As Elena pulled the fresh shirt over her head, covering the evidence that had transformed the morning's confrontation, she looked directly at Knox with an expression that carried no anger or vindictiveness, only the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to be respected without question. "The exercise is still incomplete. Are we going to finish it? Or do you need to continue processing what you've learned about making assumptions based on appearances?"
The sound of heavy boots on pavement cut through the tense atmosphere like thunder, announcing the arrival of someone whose presence would transform the morning's events from a training incident into something with far-reaching implications for everyone involved. Colonel Robert Sterling was not a man who moved quickly without good reason, but the radio call he had received in his office had brought him personally to the training area with an urgency that spoke to the seriousness of the situation. Sterling was 52 years old, with 30 years of military service that included combat tours in 3 different theaters of operation. He had commanded units in situations where the wrong decision could cost lives, and he had developed the kind of professional judgment that allowed him to assess complex situations quickly and accurately. But as he approached the crowd gathered around the obstacle course, even his extensive experience hadn't prepared him for what he was about to discover. The colonel's aide, Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, was struggling to keep pace with Sterling's determined stride, while simultaneously trying to provide him with situation reports through her radio headset. The information she was receiving from the training facility staff was fragmentary and confusing, but certain details were becoming clear.
There had been a physical altercation between participants, someone had been injured or assaulted, and the incident had somehow revealed information that was causing significant disruption to the entire program. "Sir, I'm getting reports that one of the participants may have undisclosed combat credentials," Morrison reported, her voice tight with the stress of trying to manage a situation that was clearly beyond normal administrative protocols. "Staff Sergeant Martinez is requesting immediate command review of classification levels and security clearances." Sterling's expression darkened as he processed the implications of Morrison's report. Undisclosed combat credentials in a veteran reintegration program could mean anything from simple paperwork errors to security breaches involving classified operations. But the urgency in Martinez's request suggested that whatever they were dealing with was significant enough to require immediate attention from the highest levels of command. As Sterling pushed through the crowd of participants and instructors surrounding the obstacle course, he could see the aftermath of whatever confrontation had taken place. Equipment was scattered around the wall traverse station, several participants were visibly shaken, and there was a tension in the air that suggested the situation was far from resolved. But it was when Sterling's eyes fell on Elena Vasquez that his professional composure cracked for the first time in years. The woman standing in the center of the crowd, wearing a fresh training shirt and maintaining perfect military bearing despite obvious signs of recent assault, was someone Sterling recognized immediately. "Jesus Christ Almighty," Sterling breathed, his command voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more authority than his usual bark. "Sergeant Elena Vasquez, 3rd Battalion, 7th Special Forces Group." The formal identification hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. 3rd Battalion, 7th Special Forces Group was not a unit that most regular Army personnel would recognize by name, but anyone with command-level experience knew that Special Forces groups were among the most elite units in the military. These were not soldiers who served in support roles or administrative positions. These were operators who conducted missions that regular forces couldn't handle. Elena came to attention with the automatic precision of someone whose military training was deeply ingrained, her posture shifting from civilian casualness to professional formality in an instant. "Sir," she acknowledged, her voice carrying the respectful tone appropriate for addressing a superior officer. Sterling approached Elena with the careful respect of someone who recognized that he was in the presence of a soldier whose service record was written in classified files that even colonels weren't always authorized to access. His eyes briefly tracked the evidence of injuries visible on her exposed skin, before focusing on her face with the professional courtesy that genuine combat veterans accorded each other. "Sergeant Vasquez," Sterling said formally, his voice now pitched to carry across the training area so that everyone present could hear his words clearly. "I need to ask you a direct question, and I need you to answer it honestly, regardless of any classification restrictions that might normally apply." Elena nodded once, acknowledging both the question and the implied command authority that allowed Sterling to override normal security protocols in emergency situations. "On November 15, 2019, during Operation Enduring Freedom, did you single-handedly hold a defensive position against enemy forces for 6 hours while wounded, allowing for the successful extraction of 12 civilian contractors and 4 wounded soldiers?" The question hung in the desert air like a physical presence. Elena's service record was clearly more extensive than anyone had imagined, but Sterling's specific reference to a particular date and operation suggested knowledge of events that went beyond routine military service into the realm of extraordinary heroism. Elena's response was quiet but clear enough for everyone in the immediate area to hear. "Sir, that is correct."
Sterling continued his questioning with the systematic precision of someone who needed to establish facts for the record. "During that same engagement, did you sustain life-threatening injuries from an improvised explosive device while providing covering fire for the evacuation, and subsequently refuse medical evacuation until all personnel under your protection had been safely extracted?" "Sir, that is correct." "And on January 23, 2020, were you awarded the Medal of Honor by the President of the United States for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty?" The words fell into absolute silence.
Medal is honor, the nation's highest military decoration, awarded only to those who had distinguished themselves through acts of valor so extraordinary that they transcended normal concepts of duty and courage. It was an honor that fewer than 4,000 people had received in the entire history of the United States military. Elena's voice was steady as she provided the confirmation that transformed everything about the morning's events. "Sir, that is correct." Knox, who had been standing frozen in place since the revelation of Elena's scars, made a sound that was part gasp and part sob as the full magnitude of what she had done became clear. She had physically assaulted a Medal of Honor recipient. She had torn the shirt off someone whose heroism was officially recognized at the highest levels of government and military command. Vex's face had gone completely white as he processed the implications of his own participation in harassing someone whose service record represented the pinnacle of military achievement. His infantry background, which he had used to justify questioning Elena's qualifications, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the level of heroism Sterling had just confirmed. Sterling's next words carried the weight of official command authority and left no doubt about how the morning's events would be addressed. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have just witnessed the assault of a Medal of Honor recipient. This is not only a violation of military protocol and federal law, but it represents a fundamental failure to recognize and respect the highest levels of service and sacrifice." The colonel's gaze swept across the assembled crowd, making eye contact with participants who had contributed to Elena's harassment over the past 2 weeks. "I want everyone who participated in this morning's confrontation to remain in place. There will be individual interviews, formal statements, and disciplinary proceedings that will determine the future of your participation in this program and potentially your military careers." Elena remained at attention throughout Sterling's address, her professional bearing unchanged by the revelation of her background or the obvious distress of the people around her. She had maintained her composure through 2 weeks of harassment, a physical assault, and now the public disclosure of service details that she had worked hard to keep private. Sterling turned to address Elena directly, his voice carrying the respect and admiration that one decorated veteran showed another. "Sergeant Vasquez, I owe you a personal apology for the failure of this facility to provide you with the respect and protection you deserve. This incident will be investigated at the highest levels and appropriate action will be taken to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." Elena's response was characteristic in its simplicity and professionalism. "Sir, I understand that integration challenges can create misunderstandings. I'm more concerned with ensuring that future participants receive appropriate evaluation and support than with personal grievances about my treatment here." It was a response that demonstrated the character that had earned Elena the nation's highest military honor. Even in the face of systematic harassment and assault, her primary concern was for the welfare of others rather than personal vindication or revenge. But Sterling's expression made it clear that Elena's magnanimity would not prevent appropriate disciplinary action against those who had contributed to the morning's events. The assault of a Medal of Honor recipient was not something that could be overlooked or minimized, regardless of the victim's willingness to forgive.
The administrative machinery of the United States military moved with swift and merciless efficiency once Colonel Sterling's report reached the appropriate levels of command. Within 2 hours of the incident at the obstacle course, formal investigations were launched that would ultimately involve the Department of Defense Inspector General, the Army Criminal Investigation Division, and congressional oversight committees that monitored the treatment of decorated veterans. Brittany Knox found herself in a windowless conference room at Fort Bragg's headquarters building, facing a panel of investigators whose expressions ranged from professional disapproval to barely contained disgust. The assault of a Medal of Honor recipient was not merely a violation of military discipline, it was a federal crime that carried penalties including imprisonment, dishonorable discharge, and permanent loss of veteran benefits. Specialist Knox, the lead investigator, Major Patricia Williams, began with the cold precision of someone who had spent years prosecuting military misconduct cases.
You are being charged under Article 128 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice with assault, Article 134 with conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, and additionally under Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. 704 for the desecration of military honors through your assault on Medal of Honor recipient Elena Vasquez. Knox sat in stunned silence as the charges were read, each one representing a potential career-ending violation that would follow her for the rest of her life. The military police background that she had used to justify her authority over other participants now worked against her, as investigators noted that her training should have made her especially aware of the seriousness of assaulting a fellow service member. The federal charges alone carry a potential sentence of 6 months imprisonment and forfeiture of all pay and allowances. When combined with the military violations, you're looking at court-martial proceedings that could result in dishonorable discharge and up to 5 years in military prison. The investigator placed a thick folder on the table between them, its contents representing the systematic documentation of Knox's harassment of Elena over the preceding 2 weeks. Phone records, witness statements, and security camera footage had been compiled with the thoroughness that the military applied to cases involving the mistreatment of decorated veterans. Multiple witnesses have testified that you led a campaign of harassment against Sergeant Vasquez based on assumptions about her qualifications and background. Your actions created a hostile environment that culminated in physical assault. This is not a case of mistaken judgment or personality conflict. This is a pattern of deliberate misconduct directed at a Medal of Honor recipient. Knox finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I didn't know. Nobody told us who she was. Her paperwork just said she was a regular veteran in the reintegration program." Major Williams' expression didn't soften. Ignorance of someone's decorations does not excuse assault, Specialist Knox. You attacked a fellow veteran based on prejudices and assumptions rather than facts. The Medal of Honor status makes the offense more serious, but it would have been equally wrong regardless of Sergeant Vasquez's background. In another conference room, Tyler Beck was facing his own reckoning with military justice. His infantry experience, which he had used to challenge Elena's presence in the program, was now being used against him as evidence that he should have recognized the signs of genuine combat experience. Private First Class Beck, your service record indicates that you completed infantry training and served one deployment in a support role. Did that training include instruction on recognizing and respecting combat veterans? Tyler nodded miserably, understanding that his own military education was being used to demonstrate that his harassment of Elena had been willfully ignorant rather than innocently mistaken. Then you should have understood that questioning another veteran's service based on appearance alone violated fundamental principles of military courtesy and respect. Your participation in the systematic harassment of a Medal of Honor recipient suggests either incompetence in applying your training or deliberate disregard for military values. The charges against Beck were similar to those facing Knox, although slightly less severe due to his follower role rather than leadership in the harassment campaign. But even the reduced charges carried potential consequences that would destroy his military career and civilian employment prospects. Meanwhile, Johnson and Fisher were learning that passive participation in harassment carried its own legal and disciplinary consequences. Military regulations were clear that failure to report or prevent the mistreatment of fellow service members constituted a violation of duty, especially when that mistreatment targeted decorated veterans. But the most immediate and dramatic consequence was the transformation that occurred within the veteran reintegration program itself. Word of Elena's true identity had spread throughout Fort Bragg with the speed of military gossip, reaching every unit, every office, and every facility on the base within hours of Sterling's revelation.
Participants in the program who had remained neutral during the harassment campaign were now facing uncomfortable questions about their own failure to intervene. Staff members who had allowed the hostile environment to develop were being reviewed for possible disciplinary action. The entire program was being scrutinized to determine how such systematic mistreatment of a Medal of Honor recipient had been allowed to continue for 2 weeks without detection. Elena herself had been relocated to private quarters befitting her status as a decorated veteran, with personal security assigned to ensure her safety while the investigation proceeded. The transition from suspected fraud to honored hero had happened so quickly that many people were still struggling to process the implications. Sergeant First Class Jake Hoffman found himself in the most precarious position of all the facility staff. As the senior instructor responsible for maintaining discipline and morale during training exercises, his failure to recognize Elena's true status and prevent her harassment represented a fundamental dereliction of duty. Sergeant Hoffman, Colonel Sterling said during their private meeting, "You had 15 years of military experience to draw upon when evaluating the participants in your program. How did you fail to recognize the signs of advanced combat training in Sergeant Vasquez?" Hoffman had no good answer. In retrospect, the evidence had been obvious to anyone with genuine combat experience. Elena's situational awareness, her tactical thinking, her physical capabilities, all of it pointed to a level of training and experience that went far beyond routine military service. "Sir, I allowed personal biases about the reintegration program to cloud my professional judgment," Hoffman admitted. "I was focused on identifying weakness rather than recognizing strength, and I failed to protect a decorated veteran from harassment under my command." Sterling's response was swift and final. "You're relieved of your position effective immediately, Sergeant Hoffman. You'll be transferred to administrative duties pending the outcome of the investigation into your handling of this situation." The administrative earthquake continued to spread as higher levels of command became involved. General Patricia Montgomery, commander of Fort Bragg, personally called Elena to apologize for the treatment she had received and to assure her that systemic changes would be implemented to prevent similar incidents. "General, my main concern is ensuring that other veterans, regardless of their decoration status, receive appropriate respect and support during their transition processes. This incident highlights systemic problems that extend beyond individual misconduct." But even as Elena maintained her focus on broader improvements, the machinery of military justice continued to process the individuals responsible for her harassment. Court-martial proceedings were scheduled, disciplinary boards convened, and administrative reviews initiated that would ultimately affect the careers and futures of everyone involved in the morning's events. The transformation from training incident to federal case had happened with breathtaking speed, but the consequences would ripple through the military justice system for months to come. The assault of a Medal of Honor recipient was not something the military establishment would allow to pass without the most serious possible response.
3 weeks after the incident at the obstacle course, Elena Vasquez found herself sitting in the Pentagon's most secure briefing room, facing a panel of generals and senior defense officials who were seeking her input on comprehensive reforms to military veteran programs. The morning's events at Fort Bragg had exposed systemic problems that extended far beyond one training facility, and the Department of Defense was determined to implement changes that would prevent similar incidents throughout the military system. "Sergeant Vasquez," General Patricia Montgomery began, her tone carrying the respect and attention that Elena's Medal of Honor status commanded. "Your experience at Fort Bragg has highlighted critical failures in how we identify, evaluate, and support veterans transitioning between different phases of military service. We're asking for your recommendations on how to fundamentally reform these programs." Elena had spent the past 3 weeks preparing for this moment, analyzing not just her own experience, but the broader patterns of behavior and institutional failures that had allowed her harassment to continue unchecked. Her recommendations would carry the weight of lived experience combined with the tactical and strategic thinking that had earned her the nation's highest military honor. "The primary failure," Elena began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from genuine expertise, "is in the assumption that veterans who appear to be struggling need support, while those who appear competent should be viewed with suspicion. This creates an environment where strength is seen as deception and vulnerability is the only acceptable way to demonstrate authenticity." She gestured to a presentation screen that displayed data compiled from veteran transition programs across multiple military installations. "The harassment I experienced wasn't unique to Fort Bragg.
Similar patterns of behavior have been documented at facilities throughout the system, suggesting that the problem is cultural rather than individual. General Montgomery nodded grimly. The investigation following Elena's assault had revealed a disturbing pattern of incidents at veteran programs nationwide, most of which had been dismissed as personality conflicts or training challenges, rather than recognized as systematic harassment of decorated veterans. What we discovered, Elena continued, is that many highly decorated veterans avoid these programs entirely because they know they'll face suspicion and harassment from people who can't understand why someone with advanced training would need transition support. The result is that the veterans who most need specialized help aren't getting it, while programs are filled with people who don't understand the complex challenges faced by those who've served in classified or high-risk operations. The solution Elena proposed was both simple and revolutionary: the creation of separate tracks within veteran transition programs designed to address the specific needs of different categories of veterans without requiring public disclosure of classified service details or decoration status. Veterans with extensive combat experience, regardless of their decoration level, need different types of support than those who served in non-combat roles. The current system forces everyone into the same program structure, which creates conflict when people with vastly different backgrounds and capabilities are expected to participate in identical activities. Under Elena's proposed system, veterans would be evaluated privately by qualified personnel who could identify appropriate program tracks without requiring public disclosure of service details. Those with advanced training or classified backgrounds would be placed in specialized programs designed to address their unique transition challenges while maintaining operational security about their actual service records. The key insight, Elena said, is that harassment often stems from people feeling threatened by capabilities they don't understand. If we eliminate the need for veterans to hide their abilities or justify their presence, we reduce the psychological pressure that leads to confrontational behavior. The proposal also included mandatory training for all staff members on recognizing and respecting different levels of military service, regardless of how those service members chose to present themselves. The training would emphasize that competence should never be viewed as suspicious, and that veterans had the right to privacy about their service details. General Montgomery was taking detailed notes as Elena outlined her recommendations. What about accountability measures for staff who failed to maintain appropriate professional standards? Elena's response reflected her understanding of both military discipline and organizational psychology. Zero tolerance for harassment based on assumptions about service background. Any staff member who creates a hostile environment for veterans should be immediately removed from the program, regardless of their own military credentials or administrative position. But the most significant change Elena proposed went beyond program structure to address the fundamental culture that had allowed her harassment to occur. She recommended the creation of a veteran ombudsman position at every facility, filled with someone with sufficient rank and authority to intervene immediately when harassment patterns developed. The person in this position needs to have the authority to stop harassment immediately, not just document it for later review. My situation continued for 2 weeks because no one with sufficient authority was paying attention to the social dynamics within the program. An ombudsman with real power could have prevented the entire confrontation.
The briefing room fell quiet as the implications of Elena's recommendations sank in. She was proposing not just procedural changes, but a fundamental shift in how the military approached veteran transition support, moving from a one-size-fits-all model to a sophisticated system that recognized and accommodated different levels of service and experience. The cost of implementing these changes, General Montgomery noted, would be significant in terms of both personnel and administrative resources. Elena's response was characteristic in its focus on outcomes rather than costs. The cost of not implementing them is higher. Every decorated veteran who avoids transition programs because they know they'll face harassment represents a failure to provide appropriate support to people who've earned it through their service.
The financial cost of reform is insignificant compared to the moral cost of continued failures. Within 30 days of Elena's Pentagon briefing, the Department of Defense issued new guidelines for veteran transition programs that incorporated nearly all of her recommendations. The directive, signed by the Secretary of Defense, established new standards for program administration, staff training, and accountability measures that would be implemented at military facilities worldwide. The changes were comprehensive and immediate. Program staff at every facility received mandatory training on recognizing and respecting different levels of military service. New evaluation procedures were implemented to ensure appropriate program placement without requiring disclosure of classified information. Ombudsman positions were created with the authority to intervene immediately when harassment patterns developed. But perhaps most importantly, the entire culture surrounding veteran transition programs began to shift from suspicion of competence to recognition that strength could coexist with the need for support. Veterans who had previously avoided these programs began participating, knowing they would be treated with appropriate respect, rather than subjected to interrogation about their qualifications. Elena herself was offered a permanent position overseeing the implementation of these reforms, but she chose instead to return to a more private role while remaining available as a consultant when programs encountered challenges. Her impact on military culture had been achieved not through seeking authority or recognition, but through maintaining her principles and allowing the truth of her service to speak for itself. The systematic changes she had initiated would prevent thousands of other veterans from experiencing the harassment and assault she had endured, transforming what had been a deeply personal violation into a catalyst for positive reform throughout the military system.
6 months after the incident at Fort Bragg, the transformation of military veteran transition programs had become a model studied by organizations worldwide. The changes Elena had recommended weren't just procedural modifications. They represented a fundamental shift in how institutions recognized and supported individuals whose capabilities might not align with conventional expectations. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, Elena's former commanding officer from 3rd Battalion, 7th Special Forces Group, had been appointed as the first Director of Advanced Veteran Integration Services, a new position created specifically to oversee the implementation of Elena's reforms. Santos brought both the operational experience to understand the challenges faced by highly trained veterans and the administrative authority to ensure that changes were implemented effectively. The results speak for themselves, Santos reported during a congressional oversight hearing 6 months after the reforms were initiated. Participation in veteran transition programs has increased by 47%, with the most significant increases among veterans with advanced training and combat decorations who previously avoided these services entirely. The statistics represented more than administrative success. They indicated that veterans who had been systematically excluded from support services were finally receiving the assistance they needed. The separate program tracks that Elena had proposed were allowing highly decorated veterans to receive specialized transition support without facing the suspicion and harassment that had characterized the previous system. At Fort Bragg itself, the transformation was both dramatic and deeply personal for those who had witnessed the morning that changed everything. The veteran reintegration facility had been completely restructured with new staff, updated procedures, and a culture that prioritized respect and professional evaluation over assumptions based on appearance or demeanor. Colonel Robert Sterling had been promoted to Brigadier General and assigned to oversee veteran services for the entire southeastern region, a position that allowed him to ensure that the reforms initiated at Fort Bragg were implemented consistently across multiple facilities. His first official act in the new role had been to establish the Elena Vasquez Center for Veteran Excellence, a specialized facility designed to serve veterans whose service backgrounds required discreet and sophisticated support services. The center represents our commitment to ensuring that every veteran, regardless of their service classification or decoration level, receives appropriate respect and support, Sterling announced during the facility's dedication ceremony. We've learned that competence should never be viewed with suspicion,
and that true strength often requires the wisdom to seek help when it's needed. Elena herself attended the dedication ceremony, wearing her dress uniform with the distinctive blue ribbon and star that marked her as a Medal of Honor recipient. Her presence drew respectful attention from media and military personnel who had come to witness what many considered a watershed moment in military culture. But the most meaningful transformation was visible in the day-to-day operations of veteran programs throughout the military system. The mandatory training for staff had eliminated the assumption that veterans who appeared competent were somehow fraudulent or undeserving of services. The ombudsman's positions had created immediate intervention capability when harassment patterns developed. The separate program tracks had allowed veterans to receive appropriate services without having to justify their qualifications to peers who might not understand their backgrounds. Sarah Williams, a former Navy SEAL who had avoided transition programs for years due to previous negative experiences, was among the first veterans to participate in the new advanced track services. "The difference is night and day," she reported during a program evaluation interview. "Instead of having to hide my capabilities or defend my presence, I can focus on addressing the actual transition challenges I'm facing." Williams' experience was replicated across hundreds of facilities as veterans who had been effectively excluded from services finally began participating in programs designed to meet their specific needs. The cultural shift was particularly dramatic among program staff who learned to view diverse capabilities as resources rather than threats. But the changes extended beyond military facilities to influence broader societal attitudes about recognizing and supporting individuals whose abilities might not align with conventional expectations. Corporate veteran hiring programs began adopting similar evaluation procedures, designed to identify and appropriately place veterans without requiring public disclosure of classified service details. Dr. Patricia Martinez, a psychologist specializing in veteran transition issues, documented the broader implications of the military's cultural shift in a comprehensive study published 6 months after Elena Vasquez Pentagon briefing. The reforms initiated following the Vasquez incident represent a paradigm shift from deficit-based thinking to strength-based evaluation. Instead of assuming that people need services because they're failing, the new approach recognizes that highly capable individuals may need specialized support to navigate complex transitions. The study's findings influenced policy recommendations that extended far beyond military contexts, suggesting applications in civilian organizations dealing with talent management, diversity initiatives, and professional development programs.
Elena's role in these broader changes remained characteristically understated. She continued to serve as a consultant when programs encountered implementation challenges, but she avoided public speaking engagements and media interviews that would have elevated her personal profile. Her focus remained on ensuring that the systems worked effectively, rather than gaining recognition for her contributions to their development. The measure of success isn't whether people remember who initiated these changes, Elena said during a private conversation with General Santos. The measure of success is whether veterans receive appropriate respect and support, regardless of how they present themselves or what assumptions people make about their backgrounds. The legal proceedings against those who had participated in Elena's harassment had concluded with results that sent a clear message throughout the military system. Brittany Knox received a bad conduct discharge and 6 months in military prison, along with forfeiture of all veteran benefits. Tyler Beck was demoted to private and transferred to a remote assignment with no possibility of advancement. The other participants received various levels of disciplinary action that effectively ended their military careers. But perhaps more importantly, the incident had become a case study in military leadership schools, used to teach future officers about the importance of recognizing and respecting diverse forms of competence. The mourning that had begun with assumptions and harassment had been transformed into a teaching moment that would influence military culture for generations. The broader cultural transformation was perhaps best illustrated by a comment from General Patricia Montgomery during a veteran advocacy conference.
The Vasquez incident taught us that our greatest strengths are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the wisdom to recognize and respect them rather than challenge and diminish them. It was a lesson that extended far beyond military contexts, suggesting new approaches to talent recognition, diversity support, and organizational culture that could benefit any institution seeking to maximize human potential while maintaining respect for individual dignity and privacy.
2 years after the morning that changed everything, Elena Vasquez stood before a joint session of Congress, not as a victim seeking justice, but as an expert witness providing testimony on the long-term effectiveness of military reform initiatives. The transformation that had begun with her assault at Fort Bragg had evolved into a comprehensive reimagining of how institutions identify, evaluate, and support individuals whose capabilities extend beyond conventional expectations. Distinguished members of Congress, Elena began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become her trademark. The reforms initiated following the incident at Fort Bragg have produced measurable improvements in veteran outcomes that extend far beyond our initial expectations. But more importantly, they have demonstrated that systemic change is possible when institutions choose to examine their assumptions rather than defend their prejudices. The statistics Elena presented were impressive by any measure. Veteran transition programs were now achieving success rates that exceeded previous benchmarks by substantial margins. Suicide rates among transitioning veterans had decreased significantly. Employment outcomes for program graduates had improved across all categories. But the most significant change was in the culture of respect and recognition that had replaced the previous atmosphere of suspicion and confrontation. Congressman James Wright, chair of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, leaned forward with obvious interest. Sergeant Vasquez, can you explain how these cultural changes have affected veterans who don't have your level of decoration or recognition? How do we know that the reforms aren't just helping elite veterans while leaving others behind? Elena's response demonstrated the comprehensive thinking that had made her recommendations so effective. The key insight, Congressman, is that respect for one veteran's service reinforces respect for all veterans' service. When staff learn to recognize and value diverse forms of competence, they become better at identifying and supporting capabilities that might not be immediately obvious in any participant. She gestured to a chart showing improvement data across different veteran categories. Veterans with no combat experience are seeing better outcomes because staff are now trained to recognize their unique contributions rather than dismissing them as non-combatants. Veterans with service-connected disabilities are receiving more appropriate support because evaluators understand that physical limitations don't indicate reduced capability. The rising tide has lifted all boats. The broader implications of Elena's reforms were becoming apparent in contexts far removed from military veteran services. Corporate diversity and inclusion programs had begun adopting similar evaluation frameworks designed to identify and support talent that might not conform to traditional expectations. Educational institutions were implementing policies that recognized different forms of student excellence rather than relying solely on standardized metrics. Dr. Michael Chen, an organizational psychology researcher at Georgetown University, had spent the past year studying the civilian applications of Elena's military reforms. His findings, published in the Harvard Business Review, suggested that institutions across all sectors could benefit from similar changes in how they approach talent recognition and support. The Vasquez model, as Chen termed it in his research, represents a fundamental shift from deficit-based evaluation to strength-based assessment. Instead of looking for reasons why someone doesn't belong, the approach seeks to understand how someone's unique capabilities can contribute to organizational success. Elena's influence was particularly evident in the training of future military leaders. The incident at Fort Bragg had become a mandatory case study in officer candidate schools, war colleges, and leadership development programs throughout the military system. Future commanders were learning to recognize that their greatest asset might be the quiet person in the corner who didn't match their preconceptions about military excellence.
Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Davis, an instructor at the Army War College, regularly used Elena's experience as a teaching tool for senior officers. The case study forces our students to confront their own biases and assumptions, Davis explained during a faculty interview. They realize that their ability to recognize and develop talent will determine their effectiveness as leaders, and that the most dangerous mistake is dismissing someone based on surface appearances. But Elena's most meaningful impact was visible in the daily experiences of individual veterans who no longer faced the harassment and discrimination that had been endemic in previous program structures. Veterans like Master Sergeant Robert Kim, a former explosive ordnance disposal specialist, whose quiet demeanor had previously made him a target for colleagues who couldn't understand how someone so calm could have survived such dangerous work. The difference is that now people understand that competence comes in different packages, Kim explained during a program evaluation interview. Instead of having to prove that I belong here, I can focus on addressing the actual challenges I'm facing in my transition to civilian life. Kim's experience was replicated in hundreds of similar stories from veterans who had found support and respect in programs that had previously been sources of additional stress and conflict. The cultural transformation was particularly dramatic among female veterans, veterans of color, and veterans whose service didn't fit conventional combat stereotypes.
Elena herself had established a private consulting practice that helped organizations implement similar reforms in civilian contexts. Her client list included Fortune 500 companies, educational institutions, and government agencies seeking to improve their talent recognition and development capabilities. The principles are universal, Elena explained during a presentation to corporate diversity officers. Whether you're dealing with military veterans, new employees, or internal promotion candidates, the challenge is the same: identifying and supporting capabilities that might not be immediately obvious or conventional. Her consulting work had revealed that the problems she had experienced at Fort Bragg were symptomatic of broader cultural issues that affected organizations across all sectors. The tendency to view competence with suspicion, to require public justification of qualifications, and to allow peer harassment of individuals who didn't conform to group expectations was endemic in competitive environments throughout society. But Elena had also discovered that the solutions were equally transferable. The evaluation procedures, accountability measures, and cultural training that had transformed military veteran programs were proving effective in corporate, educational, and government contexts where similar dynamics had previously created hostile environments for capable individuals who didn't fit conventional molds. The Elena Vasquez Institute for Excellence Recognition, established at Georgetown University with funding from the Department of Defense and private foundations, had become a center for research and training on organizational culture reform. The Institute's work was influencing policy discussions at the highest levels of government and corporate leadership. General Patricia Montgomery, now serving as the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, regularly cited Elena's reforms as an example of how individual courage could catalyze systematic institutional change. Sergeant Vasquez didn't set out to transform military culture, Montgomery noted during a Pentagon briefing, but her refusal to accept mistreatment as normal, combined with her focus on systemic solutions rather than personal grievances, created a model for positive change that extends far beyond our original context. Elena's Medal of Honor remained the most visible symbol of her service and sacrifice, but her contributions to organizational culture reform were becoming equally significant in their impact on American society. The mourning that had begun with harassment and assault had evolved into a legacy of respect, recognition, and systematic support for excellence in all its forms. As Elena concluded her congressional testimony, her final words captured the essence of the transformation she had helped create. True strength isn't measured by how loudly we announce our capabilities, but by how consistently we recognize and respect capabilities in others, regardless of how they choose to present themselves.
5 years after the fabric of Elena's training shirt tore in the Georgia morning air, revealing scars that would transform military culture forever, she stood in the Rose Garden of the White House as President Michelle Carter presented her with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor.
The ceremony recognized not her combat heroism, which had already been acknowledged with the Medal of Honor, but her contributions to organizational reform that had improved the lives of millions of Americans across military and civilian contexts. Elena Vasquez represents the best of American values, President Carter said during the presentation ceremony. Her courage under fire earned our nation's highest military honor, but her courage in the face of institutional prejudice and her commitment to systematic reform rather than personal revenge has earned something even more valuable, a lasting change in how we recognize and support excellence in all its forms. The audience in the Rose Garden included many of the people whose lives had been transformed by Elena's reforms. Veterans who had found respect and support in programs that had previously been sources of harassment and discrimination, military leaders who had learned to recognize talent that didn't conform to conventional expectations, corporate executives who had implemented similar changes in their own organizations, creating more inclusive and effective workplace cultures. Among the attendees was Dr. Patricia Martinez, whose research on the Vasquez effect had documented how Elena's reforms had spread beyond military contexts to influence organizational culture across American society. Martinez's longitudinal study had tracked the implementation of Elena's principles in over 500 organizations, finding consistent improvements in employee satisfaction, retention rates, and performance outcomes. What we discovered, Martinez explained during a post-ceremony interview, is that the fundamental insight Elena provided, that strength comes in many forms and should be recognized rather than challenged, applies to virtually every human organization. The military was just the beginning. Also present was Lieutenant General Maria Santos, Elena's former commanding officer, who had overseen the implementation of veteran services reform throughout the military system. Under Santos's leadership, the changes Elena had recommended had been adopted by every branch of the armed services, creating a new standard for how military personnel evaluated and supported their colleagues. The transformation has been complete, Santos reported during a briefing with defense journalists following the ceremony. We've gone from a culture that viewed quiet competence with suspicion to one that recognizes excellence regardless of how it presents itself. The change has made us not just more inclusive, but more effective as a fighting force. The statistical evidence of the reform's success was overwhelming. Military retention rates had improved across all categories as service members no longer felt pressured to conform to narrow behavioral expectations. Combat effectiveness had increased as commanders learned to recognize and utilize diverse forms of tactical thinking. Veterans' transition success rates had reached historic highs as service programs became genuinely supportive rather than potentially hostile environments. But perhaps the most significant measure of Elena's impact was visible in the faces of individual veterans who had benefited from the cultural transformation she had initiated. Veterans like Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, whose quiet analytical style had once made her a target for harassment, but was now recognized as a valuable leadership asset. 5 years ago, I would have been afraid to participate in any group training exercise, Welsh admitted during a veteran advocacy conference. The Elena Vasquez reforms didn't just change policies, they changed the fundamental culture of respect that allows people like me to contribute without fear of harassment or discrimination. Elena's influence had extended far beyond military contexts through her consulting work and the research conducted at the Elena Vasquez Institute for Excellence Recognition. Corporate diversity programs had adopted her evaluation frameworks, reducing workplace harassment while improving talent identification and development. Educational institutions had implemented similar approaches, creating more inclusive environments for students whose capabilities didn't conform to traditional academic models. The private sector transformation was particularly dramatic in technology companies, where Elena's principles had helped organizations recognize and support diverse forms of technical talent. Companies that had previously relied on narrow hiring criteria were discovering innovative capabilities in candidates who might have been overlooked under previous evaluation systems. Microsoft CEO Sandra Chen credited Elena's reforms with helping her company achieve breakthrough improvements in both innovation and workplace culture. The Vasquez model taught us to look for competence rather than conformity. The result has been teams that are not only more diverse, but more effective at solving complex problems. Elena herself had remained characteristically focused on systemic improvements rather than personal recognition, even as her influence spread throughout American society. Her consulting practice continued to help organizations implement culture reforms, while the institute bearing her name had become a leading center for research on excellence recognition and organizational development.
The real measure of success, Elena said during her acceptance speech at the Presidential Medal of Freedom ceremony, isn't whether people remember the individual who initiated change, but whether the change becomes so integrated into organizational culture that it feels natural and permanent. Her words reflected the profound transformation that had occurred in the 5 years since her assault at Fort Bragg. What had begun as a deeply personal violation had evolved into a national model for organizational reform that was being studied and implemented throughout the world. The European Union had commissioned a study of Elena's reforms as a potential framework for improving veteran services across member nations. The United Nations had included her principles in guidelines for supporting displaced persons and refugees. The World Health Organization had adopted similar approaches for supporting healthcare workers who might not conform to traditional professional expectations. But for Elena, the most meaningful legacy remained the daily experiences of individual veterans who no longer faced the harassment and discrimination that had once been endemic in military culture. Every veteran who could participate in transition programs without fear of judgment, every service member who could contribute their unique capabilities without facing suspicion, every military leader who had learned to recognize excellence in all its forms, these were the true measures of the transformation she had helped create. As the Rose Garden ceremony concluded and guests mingled in the late afternoon sunshine, Elena found herself in conversation with a young Army lieutenant who had recently completed officer training at West Point. The lieutenant, who had grown up in the post-Vasquez military culture, seemed genuinely puzzled by the idea that competent veterans had once faced systematic harassment. "Ma'am, I don't understand how the old system worked," the lieutenant said. "Why would anyone want to challenge someone's capabilities instead of learning from them?" Elena smiled at the question, recognizing that the lieutenant's confusion was itself evidence of how thoroughly military culture had been transformed. "That's exactly the right question," she replied, "and the fact that you're asking it means we've succeeded in creating the culture we were trying to build." The conversation captured the essence of Elena's legacy, a generation of military and civilian leaders who viewed diverse forms of excellence as resources to be recognized and developed rather than threats to be challenged and diminished. The morning that had begun with assumptions and ended with assault had ultimately created a new understanding of what it meant to recognize and respect human potential in all its forms.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.